How's it going, guys? My name is Zach with the Movie Castle, and today we're going to be talking about something pretty interesting. This is N from Stephen King. This is the 2008 animated version from Marvel Comics, who would refer to this as the Mobi-Sode version. Mobile, Webisode, Mobi-Sode. I don't think the term ever really caught on. This was 2008, a weird time for the internet, let's just say. This was adapted by Marc Guggenheim with art by Alex Maleev and color by Jose Villarrubia. Now, this was based on the short story N, written by Stephen King, that would appear in the Just After Sunset collection, and it was probably the best story in that bunch. It's a really good, creepy Stephen King story about this guy with OCD who goes out to like a Stonehenge place and is trying to keep an extra-dimensional force from breaking through. Really creepy, really cosmic, kind of Lovecraftian. Very, very cool stuff. And it was clearly going to be the best of these shorts, so Marvel, wanting to do something Stephen King related, chose to adapt it. Now, Marvel in the past had done some work with Stephen King before. They adapted The Dark Tower into comics, and they adapted The Stand into comics, so it was cool to see them do a new project. But boy, did they pick a strange way to adapt this one. Basically, they did sort of a motion comic with audio above it, which, if you guys seen, a lot later on, the Creepshow animated special would come out, and it was a very similar way of, audiobook, essentially, over a motion comic. So the drawings are very detailed, but they don't move super much. That's a whole thing with animation, is the simpler you make the character, the more you can animate them, and this was just essentially a little bit of animation, but basically accompanying artwork. And their plan was to do these Mobi-Sodes, 25 1 to 2 minute animated episodes that would total only like 29 minutes, have those all come out before N, the short story, in Just After Sunset came out, and then after Just After Sunset, they adapted it again as a 4-issue limited comic run, which we'll get to this version of N in a little bit. But boy, wasn't that a strange idea, to adapt a story in this weird medium and then adapt it again later on. It's such a weird concept. But yeah, let's talk about that for a minute. I said the internet was different in 2008. YouTube first came out in 2005, much different from the version we know now, and so 2008, it was still relatively new, and today's standards, if you said series of 25 1 to 2 minute clips, yeah, of course, put them on YouTube. I think back then they were getting people to download them on iTunes, and they would actually download them and save them to their phone. It's such a weird way of doing things by today's standards, but they knew the internet was going to be bigger. They knew people were watching things on the phone, but streaming capabilities, internet wherever, wasn't as big of a thing in 2008. So, if you don't want to blow through your data, you're going to have them on your phone. You're going to have the files downloaded actually on the phone, which, weird concept by today's standards, but I think that's why they're all only 1 to 2 minutes long. How much space do you have on your phone? Well, we'll chop them up into tiny bits and you can at least get a couple of them in there. And that's sort of the thing with this adaptation. With this adaptation, a lot of it, the writer and the artist, given the time that they had to do what they could, they do it pretty well, but it is just the limitations of these really weird requirements. It's kind of hard to get into the story when you go in and you go out for like 2 minute chunks. And the original short story it's all cosmic stuff. It's all about building an atmosphere, and it works really, really well when you read it as a book and you really get into the story. You really get into it. It pulls you in, and you're just feeling this absolute terror because of how it takes its time, lures you in, and you get into these characters' heads, and you're watching, like, say, the psychiatrist, who's a very calm and rational guy. All of a sudden, he's getting pulled into N's horrific world. That works much better as a short story, and the team does a good job, but when you're doing 2 minutes at a time, it's really hard to get pulled in. And nowadays, you can watch them all at once. And I do have to really appreciate Simon & Schuster. They actually have all of these on YouTube now. I cannot stress how easily an early internet project could have become lost media, but they have them all on YouTube, officially released, and you can go watch them now, which is great. And watching them all in a row is probably the best way to do it. It's super hard to get invested into a 2-minute thing. And that being said, though, it all adds up to only, like I said, about 29 minutes. And the original novel, I think, is about 4 or 5 times longer than that. So they did have to trim a lot. And that's where the key differences between this version of the story and the text-based version of N come in. A lot of the ideas, like I said, they're bigger and they pull you in more. And here, it's like, okay, we don't have 2 hours, we have half an hour. How can I cut over a lot of this? And as an abridgment, the guy who did the abridgment, Marc Guggenheim, really was smart about keeping the bits of the story where it didn't feel like you were missing much and compressing it in. But every now and then, you know, you'll hear the doctor just say, oh, N thought this, and it's a way of cutting over where in the original story N's fully explaining it, you know? So a lot of it is compression. And I believe hearing the comic version has a little bit about the Mobi-Sode's productions in the back, but I remember hearing they didn't have much time because they wanted it to all come out before the book actually came out, and you're rushing animation. That's not really a good idea. But granted, how this is motion comics, it's not super animated, they still did a good job, and I want to applaud just how much they did. The artwork is good and realistic, but it's kind of got that, you know, rotoscope feel where you get a model to pose, and I think they said it was the artist's actual accountant, and N's supposed to be an accountant. I thought that was pretty funny, but you get the model to pose and you trace over it, and in turn it looks really realistic, but in a lot of cases too realistic when you're tracing over, and you can kind of tell that's what they're doing. But a lot of good, unique pictures. They do recycle pictures, but it's not near as bad as you'd think, because, you know, sometimes when you get into recycled animations, it can get pretty egregious, but a lot of them do have new pictures, new animations. But there is things like when you actually see the monster, it's predominantly two pictures of it. There's like a close-up of the face and then a wider one, and you see those a bunch. They reference that there's stones, the stones that the thing comes out of, they have faces on them, and those faces will cycle through multiple times. And when you do a back and forth conversation, there is going to be some repeated drawings there. But that being said, it's never an egregious amount of repetition, you know, so I was a little bit worried about that, but it's interesting. But that being said, you know, I like these pictures, and I think it's a good abridgment, but N is such a good Stephen King short story. I kind of would like to take the audio version of N and then take these pictures and do a full adaptation, you know, even if, you know, it might hold on a picture for too long. I would really like to see these images accompanying the full version of N, because it's such a good story. I guess since I got some time, let's talk a little bit about the plot of N and, you know, the short story versus the comic, you know. Well, not really too much of a comparison, but I'll be talking a bit about the short story here. So in N, it's told primarily kind of that, the text version of a found footage, where it's all notes and documents and records. And there's this guy, he's a reporter, and he gets a letter from an old friend from back in his childhood in Maine. Stephen King trope there, right? And he gets this package from an old friend, and she says, my brother, who is a psychologist, just killed himself, and I found in his office this box of documents that says burn this, but of course she doesn't, and it's all these patient records about a man with OCD who he was working with right before he would kill himself, and you get to find out the story through these patient records, and I won't go into any major spoilers, but it's a really interesting story where the guy says he didn't always have OCD. He was a normal guy, he was an accountant, he was a divorcee, and he had a hobby of landscape photography. So he goes down to this field by a river, and he sees stones, and they appear to be natural, sticking out of the earth. But he notices there's 7 stones, except for when he looks through them with his camera, when he looks through the lens and there's a bit of a distance, he can see an 8th stone that isn't really there. And it's just one of those little subtle things. It's not a big monster, but it's an inarguable fracture in reality. And he looks at the stones, he sees faces subtly carved into them, and he says he gets this feeling that there's something bad in there. And if he goes and if he carefully touches and counts all the stones, he can make the 8th one solidify, where he can see it with just his eye. If he focuses on it, if he touches it, he can make it real. And if it's real, 8 is the good number, 7 is an odd number, 7 is a bad number. It can break through this otherworldly force. It can break through if there's 7, and he has to make sure that in his head the 8th stone stays real and the monster can't break out. Such a Stephen King thing, and it's this, idea. There's numbers, and they're secretly like the pattern of the world. The monster's this big Lovecraftian creature, and it's not the same entity, but he does refer to it as it several times, And I love the way King writes this story, where in the text version, it's slow, and you see how he gets into this, and you see that he has a pattern, and certain numbers are good, certain numbers are bad. Even numbers are good, odd numbers are bad, and there are even numbers that aren't as good as other even numbers, and odd numbers that are worse than other odd numbers, like 19, obviously going to be an odd number. But he says that he feels the fabric of reality is weak in everyday life, and he has to keep the fabric strong. He has to count things like people's shoes, and he has to place things like there's a tissue box and flowers on the psychiatrist's desk, and he's like, this needs to be in a diagonal line. Diagonal lines or circles are good. You have to have a pattern. So he's counting and placing and touching things to reinforce reality, to make sure that the world is sane around him. But he knows that if he goes too far without touching the stones, that 8th one will disappear. There'll be 7 and it can break through. So he's at home in his regular everyday life doing OCD task, and then when he returns to the field, he's keeping the 8th stone in place. And you can really see how this would be torture on the guy. And he really does, you can tell King must have done a bunch of work about OCD, because it seems so real, and you can tell what it must have felt like. I mean, it is downright creepy, and to really see, just how much torture this idea can, wreak upon the mind that it lives in. And, he even gets things right, like, seasonal variants, you know, where I think it's in the winter he feels better, and in the summer it acts up, you know? And you can tell that he's done all this work, but you also know from the prologue that it's going to affect the psychiatrist, and just to see it, the idea jump from one person to the next, and the idea that a killer idea can be the problem, whether or not the thing in the field is real. And that is so good and so creepy. So I really love the short story, and the animated version is an abridgment of that. It's cool to see the world actually depicted, and the people do look real. Like I said, that rotoscope thing, so it makes it feel real too, you know? And you know that if it came out nowadays and would be like a movie on Netflix, which I would love to see, but yeah, you know that internet content's coming, it's going to be a big thing, but you really don't know what. You don't know how much money and time to invest in it, but hey, original online content, that's a good step in the right direction. Yeah, it was just a motion comic, it was rushed out animation, but it's still got a solid audio track over it, and the artwork looks good, even if it really isn't super animated. So yeah, it's an interesting bit of online exclusive content before we would get to whole online exclusive movies. So it really is an interesting bit of trivia. Like I said, though, it is an abridgment, and I would definitely recommend, if you haven't read N before, read the original text version of the full story. It's so much deeper and creepier. But for this abridgment, I really do like it. I really do like the art. And I just picked up the comic, which is what inspired me to watch the cartoon version. So I'll be reviewing the comic in a few days, probably, and I'll be talking about that. And I hear that they added in some additional scenes for the comic, so I'm really looking forward to that. Anyway, to everyone who's watched so far, thank you for watching. To everyone who's liked and subscribed, thank you. You really are helping the channel out. I'll leave a relevant playlist on the bottom. This should be my Stephen King playlist. I've talked about The Mist, The Langoliers, but I've also talked about the Creepshow animated special, which is very similar to this, and in that one, it's 2 half-hour, essentially long stories. One is Survivor Type by Stephen King, and the other is Twittering from the Circus of the Dead by his son Joe Hill. So if you like N, definitely check out the Creepshow animated special. Very much in the same vein. Anyway, have a good day. I'll see you guys again very, very soon. Stephen King playlist on the bottom. Have a good day now.